Hello, everyone. Depending on the time zone, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I would like to thank all of you for joining our Photonics Online Meetup discussion panel session. My name is Saad Bin-Alam, and I am a PhD student studying at the University of Ottawa in Canada. Currently, I am exactly in the middle of my PhD studies, and for the last few months, during the pandemic, when I locked myself inside my room, a thought often has been disturbing me repeatedly. What I will do after 1 to 2 years? Shall I continue working in academic research, or should I try my luck beyond academia, either industry, policymaking, or start my own business? And I'm pretty sure it is not only me, but most of the third and fourth year PhD students typically start thinking like that. So in this situation, people like me require the suggestion from experienced people who already have selected different paths, gone through all good and odds, and eventually succeed in their career. Now, as PhD students, every day from dawn to dusk, we hear from our supervisors or postdocs that make academia great again. But we don't have enough opportunity to hear from the people from outside the academia. That's why today we invite 3 young researchers who graduated with PhDs and have since moved on to 3 different career paths. I would like to welcome Dr. Anna Grushina, Dr. Marina Madrid, and finally, Dr. Samantha McBinney. Okay, so nice to meet all of you.
Thank you for introduction.
Thank you.
Okay, so while as the session chair, I will run the session for the next 1 hour. The panelists will answer questions from our virtual audiences over the course of this time duration. So first, I will invite all panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And I'd like to start with Dr. Grushina at the beginning. So Anya, please go ahead.
Yeah, you can call me Anya, it's fine.
Thank you.
So I work as a technical communications expert and also sales expert at Heidelberg Instruments Nano, which is a subdivision of Heidelberg Instruments, producer of laser and thermal probe lithography equipment that probably some of you use.
Okay, great. So Marina, could you please go ahead?
Thanks. So my background's in physics. I did my PhD in applied physics in a femtosecond laser lab at Harvard. During the last year of my PhD, I co-founded, along with one of my lab mates and a third co-founder, our startup. And our startup is called Seleno, and it's based off of laser-based techniques that we co-invented during our PhD. So we were using lasers to create tiny bubbles that could poke holes in cell membranes to deliver cargo into the cells. And now we're applying that process to engineer cells for cell therapies.
Okay, awesome. So I'd like to turn to Dr. Samantha. Please, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Sam, and I got my PhD in biomedical engineering from USC, actually with Professor Armani. Graduated, coming up on 3 years ago. And now I work at the RAND Corporation, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And really, we do a lot of research with the goal of influencing policy and decision-making.
Nice. Thank you very much for your great introduction. So now, I would like to ask all of you a question. I think everyone in the session want to ask all of you. So please tell me, all of you, why did you choose different career paths than academia? Did you leave academia for any reasons? Who can go ahead?
So I never considered being a PI or leading an academic research lab. So it wasn't really a tough decision to me. It was never something I really thought of, just because I've seen a lot of people try to go that path, and it's so difficult and it's so competitive. And the way the system is set up, it's just not sustainable for everyone to try to go down that path. But also, I don't enjoy writing grants. So there was a lot of actual day-to-day work that I knew I wouldn't enjoy. I would have stayed in academia for teaching. So I do love teaching. And I think a full-time lecturer position is something that I would have been interested in. But it's also something where I felt like I could go back to that if I needed to. Whereas the startup opportunity was something where I felt like if I was going to do it and going to try it out, I had to do it then. So that was kind of why I went the path that I went.
Okay, you said you don't want to become PI, but through your PhD, you already learned from your PI how to run a group, how to run research. So you are already experienced. Now, after your PhD, you chose a completely different path about what you had no idea before. But like, if I would be in that situation, maybe I would be very worried. I mean, what I will do in future. So how could you manage that thing? Like starting completely different thing. And I know you work with your batchmate
yeah, one of my co-founders is my lab mate, and our third co-founder is actually someone who has a lot more experience founding companies. So he's a serial entrepreneur. So that definitely helped. But I will say that it was really hard because there are things that we had to do that we had no idea how to do it. And so there were a lot of things that I had to do that I just wasn't qualified for, didn't have training for. And there are things that were possible to learn, but like, for example, accounting and HR are things that your PhD definitely doesn't train you for. But in an early stage startup, you have, less than 5 people working. So someone has to do it. So a lot of the co-founders end up wearing a lot of hats. And in general, the way I learned how to do things that I didn't have training for was by reading about them, like literally by Googling or by talking to people who had done them before. Yeah.
Okay, so that means that you did all kind of analysis, risk factor, or okay. That's really challenging. Like I can't imagine, I mean, how difficult that path would be. But yeah. So Samantha, what's about you? Like why you choose a path of policy making? Like you were in biomedical science, or if I remember, but what you are now doing is completely different, I guess.
Completely different. Yeah, so I think for me, it was really the result of a specific project I was working on that occupied the vast majority of my time the last 3 or so years of my PhD. In short, I was working on developing a malaria diagnostic specifically for use in low resource settings. And you're operating in this highly controlled environment. On paper, we know that anti-malarials exist and they're very effective. So the cure or the treatment box is kind of checked. And so in my mind, I think, well, if I can design a diagnostic specifically for people who don't have access to labs and microscopes and all those things, then we've got all the boxes checked. And in theory, malaria is not really a problem anymore. And I think that the point where I kind of realized I wanted to do more policy type work was when I realized that that was not the reality. And the reality was that, yes, in theory, all those things are right, but there's this huge, huge, huge market for counterfeit antimalarials in much of sub-Saharan Africa, which is a reality that we are not often faced with working in high-income countries. High-income countries have very different problems than low to middle-income countries do. And the concept of you could put all this work into this fantastic device that's intended to help people, and there's still this huge gap between what people need and what they have access to, was the point at which I realized I was more interested in doing work on that policy kind of back end, and that technology was really just the start of solving a lot of these problems. If you don't have proper policy in place to actually deploy technologies, if you don't have policy in place to combat fake medicines being disseminated broadly, a lot of what scientists and engineers are doing can still fall short, which was really the push for me to work at a place like RAND. So.
Okay, great. So I'll be back to you later again, but before that, I would like to hear from Ania.
I didn't mention that before. I was doing a PhD also in physics at Geneva University in Switzerland. And I was working on quantum electronics and graphene devices. So it was super fun, super interesting, but also super complicated. And at some point, I have realized that what I learned in PhD was very, very specific. And I couldn't really envision the big picture, like where I could really take my expertise and what I could do with it. So I didn't really feel very confident about my chances. And then I thought that given the statistics, right, around 8 to 10% end up with permanent positions in academia, even though that was kind of initially the plan, I was like, probably I'd be wiser to just quit now that is early enough and make the switch and find myself elsewhere. And my goal was to stay close enough to academia, to things I'm passionate about. I love physics. I love research. I really like the people who work in it. So, and I managed. So that was mostly my reasoning.
Okay, that's also great. But I just searched your profile online and I found in Google Scholar that during your PhD, you published a paper in Nature Communication and also in PRL.
APL.
So,
no, APL, applied. Not a big difference.
And now you are working in a company, Heidelberg Instrument, where you actually work for marketing. So how, can you please tell us how you utilize your experience from your PhD in this field, like marketing, or, oh, you're also editor of a magazine. Yeah.
Yes.
Now I can relate a bit. Okay, so can you please tell how you can relate this?
Right.
Thing?
So, of course, I had my first experience in writing scientific papers during PhD. But if you look at papers written by early stage researchers and compare them with papers written, for example, review papers written by senior professors, you'll see a lot of quality difference just in how the ideas are explained and transmitted and how the knowledge is organized, right? Because it takes a lot of time of flight of writing this very same grant application again and again and again and learning how to polish it. And yes, there are rules. And I actually by myself go back to, kind of how to write a good article, how to write a good review, how to make a good presentation every now and then. But it's really practice that makes a master here, right? So what I learned in terms of scientific writing and communication during my PhD was just the first step, right? Then as I was looking for jobs, I also began doing science journalism kind of randomly. I like writing in general, but I never thought of that as a career. And actually, that was, I think, what really helped me a lot at the job that I'm doing now. And yeah, so I was always curious about how social networks work, how marketing through internet works, right? The world we live in. And yeah, I can kind of marry my scientific expertise and also my interests and hobbies in what I do. And that's pretty awesome. And I get to talk. So for the magazine that I'm making, it's a Heidelberg Instruments magazine called The Lithographer. So I make articles about lithography, and or I collect articles. Let's say some stuff I write myself. For some stuff, I interview really the most amazing researchers in the field. For some things, my colleagues support me and we write little expert know-how pieces. So we collect all of this together, and it's been, I've never had a magazine, so I'm learning on the job, but it's huge fun, definitely.
So I'm curious to know one thing, like when we students write a paper, we try our best to sell our paper. So in your case, is it also true when you try to sell your product of your company?
Well, I work in sales, so the answer is kind of obvious, right? But, we sell equipment that costs a few $100,000 or more. People are not going to buy it just because you said something nice or you just, put it in a nice sentence. You have to, this is actually where my training as a scientist gives me an extra edge, because I have to demonstrate to you, right? people who do research, people who are trained to think critically, people who are trained to seek evidence. I have to prove to you that our tools are going to solve your problems, right? And this is not easy at all. And we know our tools quite well. We know the competition quite well. And that's the thing. If we know that our tool is not going to do that, we're just not going to sell it to you, right? We're going to say, look, it looks like it's not our range. We cannot do this very specific thing. But if it can, then perhaps you are convinced, and then you can write a grant application, and then you get the tool and make even more amazing research. So yes, we sell, but there is only that much you can sell, especially to researchers.
That's great. So we already started getting some questions from the audience. So one person asked, how did your PhD prepare you for an industry career? Is your research directly related to your current work? So I think Marina can start at first.
Yeah, sure. So I would say my current work is loosely related to my PhD research in the sense that we did start the company based off of this laser-based technology that my lab mate and I had co-invented during our PhDs. But it's also evolved a lot since then, because starting a company out of a PhD, I've always felt like it's kind of doing things backwards. The right way to start a company would be to identify the problem you're trying to solve, figure out what's the best solution, and then build a company around that solution. But when you're coming out of a PhD, you have a solution and you're trying to like backfit it to the right problem. So by the time you actually find the right market fit in the application you're interested in, the technology has had to evolve quite a bit to be useful for that specific application. So like, yes, we're using lasers, but we're not doing the same things with them that I was doing during my PhD. We're not using the same type of laser system. We're not using the same type of nanofabricated substrates. So it's evolved a lot since then. Like a kind of less tangible way in which my PhD has prepared me for an industry career is that it's a good place for figuring out how to learn new things quickly. And it's a good place for kind of trying a bunch of different things and experimenting and prototyping quickly. And that's been really useful in the startup. But there are a lot of things also that I felt like my PhD didn't prepare me for very well in my career. I think there are a lot of soft skills that don't get trained during the PhD that end up being really useful in your career, like interviewing, networking, presenting well. Presenting well was something that my PhD advisor actually focused a lot on, but a lot of PhD advisors don't. So.
Okay. Actually, I am interested to know more about how you and your partner started your own business. But before that, I would like to pass the same question to Samantha and then Anya. I mean, how did your PhD prepare?
Yeah, so actually to kind of pick up on the soft skills that Marina just touched on, and I'm sure Anya feels even more strongly in her position of writing so much, they are crucial. And I know that as scientists and engineers, we can often overlook the soft skills, whether it's writing, whether it's networking, any of those things. And I don't think that I can stress enough, particularly from a place like RAND, where we do a lot of writing and we have to be able to distill very complex topics into a format that's readily accessible by essentially the voting populace. Writing is huge. And if you're a good writer, I think that really elevates you in any workplace you're in, and sets you apart from virtually every other scientist or engineer who typically tend to focus on more of the hard science skills. Soft science is not something to be overlooked. But in terms of using my PhD in my current workplace, yes and no. I couldn't have gotten my job without a PhD, but I do not use the fact that I got a PhD in optics at all, virtually ever, except when we're talking about directed energy weapons and lasers and things like that. And then people get very excited that I have a background in this. But no, RAND is very academic in a lot of ways. They have a research track. They hire PhDs only, really PhDs, or if you've been in the military for decades, you can also become a researcher. even the titles are the same. You start out as an associate researcher, then you move to full, then you move to senior. It's roughly the same timeline as you move up. You're not getting promotions every 1 to 2 years. And so I could not have gotten the job without having a PhD, but I don't necessarily use the fact that, you know, I build medical devices in grad school every day. But it is a skill set that I can bring to a lot of projects, and being an engineer at a policy think tank does put me in a unique position where there are not a lot of engineers at RAND that have hands-on experience. So when there is a project that requires real technological expertise, people in my position are often called on because there aren't that many folks who spent time in labs building things. So a little bit of both.
Yeah, I agree with what Samantha, I was just going to say, I agree with what Samantha was saying, in that the PhD is a good way to get your foot in the door and to get that first job, but there's always going to be some skills you need to learn, and there's almost always going to be some sort of training period before you feel like you've mastered your new position.
Actually, I think to some extent I would disagree with that. I have seen quite some cases when PhD was definitely not required, even for industry research jobs. And even from our own company, I see people in our tech team and processes and applications team who don't have a PhD, but believe me, they do things that are just as hardcore as the people with PhDs. And it's a matter of having the right training, and the degree does not necessarily bring it, right? I mean, it might, but it doesn't have to. So a lot of people entered through internship program. So, you know, after their master's, so I think someone even from their bachelor's, I'm not sure. But yeah, they just did really well for these few months. We looked at them, they looked at us, and it worked out. And we have a really cool team. Like, I'm jealous sometimes of what these guys do. So
now, suppose if I am passionate about doing job in industry, and I am a PhD student, so do you think I am actually wasting my time?
That depends. What industry, what kind of PhD are you doing? What kind of relationships are you having with your supervisor? What do you want to do? There's no one answer fit all, I'm afraid.
I definitely think it's field dependent. There are some fields where a PhD is almost a requirement for certain levels of positions. So it also depends on like what level of position you want, and it depends on the field you're in.
And honestly, I don't, and maybe this is too rose-colored glasses, I hesitate to believe that a PhD is ever a waste of time. If you're in the middle of the program and you're wondering, should I finish, should I not? It's one thing if you're in undergrad and you're wondering if you should even start. But if you've started the program and you have a positive relationship with your advisor and you enjoy the work that you're doing, and even if halfway through you decide, I specifically want a job that does not require a PhD, and I don't even know if it's going to help me. If you can, if you're in the financial position, if you're in the academic position, if you're in the position to be able to continue with it, I would absolutely recommend it, because you do learn some skills kind of navigating grad school that I think would be difficult to learn elsewhere, unless you are. I mean, I see, at least from people I know who are in the startup world, I see a lot of parallels between obstacles and hurdles you have to navigate in grad school and those you have to navigate starting your own company. But I would definitely say try to stick with it. That being said, there are always, like Anya said, there's never a one size fits all. There's never a universal answer to these questions. It's highly dependent on your specific circumstance. But I definitely don't think it was a waste.
I'm a strong proponent of doing a PhD just because this is like the most awesome thing you can think of. I think if you want to do research or have an engineering job, there are probably better ways to get into that. But come on, when are you gonna work on something as cool as what usually people do for their PhDs? And for me, I did a PhD because I found a project that was like, you know, for me, it did check all the coolness boxes, right? So.
Okay, that's great. So that's the thing, really, we want to know, like what we are doing that would be helpful for us. and we should do what we want to do, what we love to do. Anyway, so we got a question from Lexi. Do you have any advice for current students on how to improve some of these soft skills that may get overlooked during their PhD? Marina?
Yeah, I would recommend finding a mentor whose soft skills you like. So for example, if you're trying to get better at presenting, identify someone whose presentations you like and ask them if they're willing to spend some time with you. I think a lot of people are kind of nervous or hesitant to cold email or cold ask people for their time. But a lot of people got to be as good as they are because someone else gave them some of their time. So I think a lot of people are like surprisingly willing to help people who are asking for help.
Okay.
I would say, I would also add learn to Google, because many things have surprisingly straightforward solutions already. You know, you're probably not the first person looking for whatever. So that's one thing. Another thing, if you're interested in, let's say, industrial research jobs or something along these lines, look for internships, because from what I have seen, many jobs are offered officially or on LinkedIn or whatever, have to be offered by the legal rules. And in fact, there are already some candidates kind of pre-selected for this position. And how do you get to be the candidate who was pre-selected for this position? It's networking, but not the kind of networking when you drink coffee with people, which is of course also great, but it doesn't, I mean, you have to keep in mind that hiring a new person is always a risk for a company, because they would be wasting time and money on training you and paying your salary if you don't fit, right? So if you can bridge that by doing an internship, then you're winning, because you already have experience, you already know what this job is, you already know if you really want it, and the company knows if they really want you, and then it's kind of a straightforward thing from there.
Okay. Samantha, do you want to add anything to this question?
You know, I think those two really covered it. And when it comes to the soft skills, I think exposing yourself to a lot of different styles of presentations in particular is key. And I love to do this just by like watching or listening to TED Talks. Different TED Talk speakers have distinctly different styles and approaches, and you can kind of just listen and learn and pick up on things you like, things you don't like, and start to piece together your own style. Because I think authenticity, as cliche as that might sound, I think it is important when you're presenting your work, is coming off as genuine and really yourself. That's when you're gonna do best in those kinds of soft skill positions, I think.
Okay. I think this is a really nice answer from everyone. So now I'm going to move to the next question. Is anyone familiar with internships at the PhD level? Is that useful? So I think Anya was talking about internship at some place. Can you more focus on that? Like,
well, I think anyone can do an internship, right? So I think it's more typical to do it before PhD, so like after bachelor's or master's, but I see no reason why you cannot do it after PhD.
Okay. Any experience from Samantha or Marina about?
So RAND does have a summer associate program, which is fairly typical for people in the middle of their PhD programs to leave for a summer and do work at RAND. And that is an excellent way to get a job at RAND. That is not the direction I went. And I think almost more because in my mind, I never even really considered a summer internship, which is probably the position a lot of PhD students are in, because I viewed the summer as like, okay, this is the time when the campus is empty, a lot of students are gone, this is where you can really put your nose to the grindstone, and no classes, no nothing. And so I think that it really depends on maybe how long you're willing to spend getting your PhD. Is your advisor okay with you going off to do an internship? Some advisors had very hard and fast rules, absolutely no, never. Whereas others were, you know, more open to conversation. And so, but it's certainly, it can be a great way, like Anya said, to get your foot in the door. Absolutely. but it's not necessarily critical. So if you're in a PhD program where you either don't want to, or your advisor has a rule that says no, you are okay. You will be okay. You can figure out ways around it. It can just kind of be a shortcut sometimes if you're fortunate enough to be able to take that route.
But another possibility could be working or collaborating on a project with a company, because many equipment manufacturers, for example, well, I speak of something I know, right? So we collaborate a lot with some users. And I think if there is a, if we have an opening and one of our super users is looking for a job, it's going to be a very short conversation. I mean, if they want it, of course. So, yeah.
And Marina, do you have anything to?
I never did any internships, but I definitely wish I would have. I think it's a really good opportunity to try something new, even if you don't end up working there. And that's something that's a lot harder to do when you're more established in your career. When you have a full-time job, you're not going to take off 3 months to try something new. So I think it's definitely worth trying.
Okay. So before the question I took a few minutes ago, I asked you, could you please share your story with your partner? How did you jump on this decision, entrepreneurship? And how did you start?
Yeah, it definitely wasn't planned. So actually the way it started is we had gone to Photonics West, which is a conference that y'all are probably very familiar with in San Francisco. And we had decided kind of on a whim to present at the startup fair there. And I was the person who presented. And I remember feeling very out of place because I think of the semifinalists, I was the youngest and the only woman and the only person of color. And then in the last, 6 people, I was also youngest, only woman, only person of color. There were a couple people whose companies were very far ahead, whereas we had just been playing with the idea of creating a startup. We literally came up with the name like for the purpose of that startup competition. And I remember being really disappointed after I presented because I didn't get any questions from the judges. So we thought, oh, they didn't like it. We'll sit here and be polite and listen for the awards. But we weren't expecting anything. And then we got first place. So it was a really cool moment for us because it was validating in a way. I think a lot of times you're working on something so specific during your PhD that it's not necessarily of use or interest to the wider world. It's like of use or interest to a very specific niche group. And because we won and a lot of people expressed interest, we realized that what we were working on could actually be useful in a commercial sense. So that was what motivated us to take this path. It was not something that my co-founder or I had considered before.
Okay. So a very similar question I can see.
I'm very sorry, can I interject shortly?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it's actually somewhat similar to how Heidelberg Instruments Nano has started, because before it was called Swisslit, and it was a startup that spun off from the technology developed at IBM Research Zurich my boss is one of the founders. So they were developing this technology during their PhDs, and they just took it out. And basically they did what you are doing now, Marina.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's good to see an example of a successful optics-based company.
Right. But yeah, it isn't easy, definitely.
Yeah. So a question I can see in the list. Do you think you planned the way to where you at now, or the circumstances and opportunities made it happen while you stayed open? And another person just wrote as a comment after that question. He's also curious about that, and he is curious to know what percentage did you set out to get to this point in your career compared to luck getting you where you are. So Samantha?
I might not be the best person to ask about luck because I think luck is 90% of the reason why I am where I am right now.
I think luck happens to people who are prepared.
But yeah, and so I definitely, I would not say I planned to ever be at RAND. So I had heard about RAND kind of all growing up. My father was an avid NPR listener, so NPR and RAND are tight. So I kind of always knew about them, but in a very behavioral science way, not in an engineering way. And so I definitely never thought working at a place like Rand was really an option for an engineer until like a year and a half or so before I graduated. And so I don't think that I necessarily knew that I was preparing for Rand in particular, but I do think that I was preparing to be in the position that I'm in, which is being at a company that I hope to stay at indefinitely, and a company where there is tremendous potential to have pretty far-reaching impact given the work that we do. I think impact was always something I've been chasing. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to be an engineer. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to work on this malaria project with my advisor. And that's definitely one of the reasons why I ended up at a place like Rand. So I think very big picture, it's right in line with the direction I've kind of always been going in. I just never knew the specifics of exactly when I would end up exactly where. So.
That's interesting. Another person asked a very simple question: how do I get a job out of my PhD? And I would like to add the next question: how did you find your job? What made you pick your specific company? So, Ania, I think
I can tell my story. It's a bit crazy. So something I have to tell, and probably it might be relevant to some of the people who listen to this. I only have a Russian passport. And if you don't have the right passport, it's sometimes, many times more difficult to get a job in the country where you don't have a work permit. And that happened to me. So to get my first position, I think I've sent more than 100 applications, and they were just largely ignored, despite of me definitely having relevant background. And that was definitely, that was quite unsettling. It took forever. So I gave myself about a year to find, I wanted a job in R&D, right? I wanted to do industrial research or something like that. And I gave myself about a year. And when this year was kind of up and there were no interviews coming, or virtually no interviews coming, and I didn't want to go, I mean, I had some options as a research engineer at an institute or postdoc, but I thought, no, I'm cutting the direct ties with academia, right? And so I got this position in sales. So it was an application engineer position. And I did 100% sales of research equipment. This job was tough. We did cold calls half a day and cold emails another half a day. I mean, this was really, really not easy. I learned a lot though. I mean, and then I lost that job because it's really hard to sell scientific equipment via cold calls. I did manage to sell a couple of systems, and they were like about 2,500,000 worth. So it wasn't all that bad, right? But, you know, I was happy I lost that job. And then I was looking for a new job, and then I was basically open to whatever, well, within certain reasonable bounds, right? So I really was opening my mind and saying, okay, I'm sure there are plenty of opportunities that I didn't even think of, because what do I know about outside of academia world? And then I saw this job where I was almost 100% fitting. It was another sales position at Heidelberg Instruments Nano. And I was like, no, but it was so terrible the previous time. I'm not going to go there. And also I was pregnant. So long story short, I applied, and my boss called me. Well, he actually spoke to my previous boss, and apparently he didn't shit talk me too much. So yeah, and I came to the interview with a 7-month pregnant belly. And they said, well, you probably cannot take the sales position because we really travel a lot. And I didn't travel that much in the previous position. But since I had the background that was so well aligned with what company did, and since I did science journalism kind of on the side as a hobby, as an intermediate sort of thing, they said, look, would you like to write for us? And I said, well, yeah. And there I am now. So you never know, really, you never know what hobby, what skill, what encounter puts you in the place you are. I mean, it's sort of logical if you backtrack, but yeah, I wouldn't be able to, let's say, construct my today being 10 years ago or 7 years ago, even 5 years ago.
Next question is, how is the industry environment different from academia? I think again, Anya should give the answer, but I will go to the other people also.
Depends what you consider, right? I mean, people-wise, not different at all. You get the same crowd. I also get to publish something. I get to go to conferences. So in many aspects, it's not so different. Of course, day-to-day work, again, depends on your position, might vary. And of course, depending on the size of the company where you work at, you may have different challenges and things to consider. Let's put it that way.
Okay. Marina or Samantha, do you want to add how you find your current job place different from your PhD life?
Yeah, I find it super different. I think, okay, so I get to publish still, which is cool, which I wasn't expecting. I get to go to conferences still. I actually enjoy them a little bit more, I think, than I did during my PhD, because I feel like I have more of a purpose, or I'm more focused in terms of what I'm trying to get out of it. But it's so different in terms of, for me at least, like how I spend my day and how I focus my work, because everything has to be geared towards making this company successful, making a product, selling the product. So every once in a while, there are experiments that pop up, because everyone on our team, it's a very scientific and technical team. So every once in a while, like ideas for experiments would pop up. Oh, wouldn't it be really interesting to measure this effect or figure out why that's happening, or like image this protein structure? And it's like, no, if it doesn't contribute to a product that we're going to be able to sell people successfully, then we're not going to spend time doing it. So I think that kind of shift in mindset is a big change for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think agreeing with Marina, there are a surprising number of similarities between, maybe not surprising, Rand is not kind of a midway, not necessarily industry, but definitely not, pure academic research. We're definitely somewhere in the middle. We do a lot of writing, there's a whole side of the house. So essentially, roughly half of our work comes from the Department of Defense, which is contract based. But then about half of our work is just purely academic, getting grants and proposals out there, getting funding from foundations or NIH or NSF. And that's obviously very academic. We attend conferences. It definitely is a publish or perish type of institution. You need to publish if you want to move up. Publishing looks different because we do have RAND reports are a thing. So it's not a journal, but it is published essentially in-house. We still have external reviewers and things, but it's not necessarily the same as publish in a journal. RAND reports count just as much. So there are a lot of similarities really in the day-to-day, especially if you're coming from more behavioral sciences. For STEM folks, for engineers, for people used to doing bench work, it's very different because it's all desk work. You're essentially at your desk. I mean, especially during COVID where we're not traveling, you're doing a lot of reading, a lot of writing, a lot of phone calls, a lot of synthesis, it's all on your laptop, which was a huge adjustment for me. But otherwise it's similar in a lot of ways, that's for sure. There was a question before about like how you got a job out of your PhD and how we picked our companies that we're at. And I do think that's an important one to touch on just because it can look so different for different types of work. And I guess from my experience, I found RAND because I knew I wanted to do policy work. And I kind of went at it from the angle of putting all my eggs in one basket. RAND was kind of the end all and be all and a little bit of the gold standard. And so I knew if I really, really desperately want to work there, let's just focus 100% of my efforts on that. So I applied to one job. I did the cold calls, the cold emails that both other ladies have mentioned, which can be awkward for sure, but basically setting up those informational interviews with people who already worked at RAND to talk to them about what does your job look like, trying to kind of gauge things and see, is this somewhere I would want to work? What do your day-to-day activities look like? What do you like about your job? What do you hate about your job? Which was another question I saw in the Q&A. And you get really interesting, candid responses when you ask people, what's your least favorite part about what you do? And it's funny because at Rand, the number one thing everyone complains about is the fact that we have to fill out timesheets at the end of every day, because we do billable hours. And I was like, okay, well, if you take a big step back, and that's what everyone's complaining about, not the people, not the research, not the impact. And I'm like, okay, I think that's something we can figure out. If you're complaining about culture or your coworkers, or I don't feel like I'm making a big difference in the work that I do, or I don't enjoy the work that I do, those are concerns I think you should hear and really think about. But if someone's complaining about something really petty, like filling out a timesheet, then they've got it pretty good. So I think that for all of those reasons, I kind of landed on Rand, heavily pursued it. And then it was a really long application process because, like Anya said before, companies don't want to hire people unless they're pretty sure that they want to keep them, because it is expensive to hire people and ramp them up, especially coming into the policy space as an engineer. They probably knew that it was going to be pretty resource intensive to get me up to speed. And so it was a long process, but really it boiled down to lots of reaching out to perfect strangers and setting up phone calls and in-person meetings, which I know isn't really an option these days. But I do feel like a lot of people are much more open to Zoom calls, which it's a great way to take advantage of the virtual environment and really like get that face-to-face time. It's not the same, but it does carry a very similar weight in being able to see someone's face. It's gonna be much more difficult for Anya to reject an application that comes across her desk if she has that unconscious bias of like, I have seen this person, I enjoy, like, I've seen what their mannerisms look like, I enjoyed talking to them. It's going to be
they
hard
seem legit, right?
That.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to, I would like to add something. So there is another avenue to getting a job that I think I haven't heard of that much when I was in job search. There are third companies that subcontract people like us to companies like Rand, for example. And I think it's usually not as well paid as internal jobs, because the middleman always gets a slice, right? And you don't have, well, the contract conditions are just not as good. But on the other hand, you can think of it as a paid internship, right? So it's also not a bad way to get your foot in the door. Maybe it's a little bit more difficult in COVID times, because I know many companies were like the first people who were fired were the third-party employees, sadly. But I mean, in, let's say, the normal world, that's definitely something to consider.
Okay, great.
And actually, I have heard that big companies typically or very rarely hire directly outside of these third companies. So you really have to go through this way.
There's also kind of similarly, you can work with a recruiter. So recruiters' jobs are to like find people's jobs. And if you're the person who's trying to find a job, you often don't have to pay, because the way they get paid is the company will pay them like 25% of your salary or something if they decide to hire you, and it ends up working out. And it working out is usually measured by whether or not you stayed there more than 3 to 6 months. So that's another option. But I definitely agree with what Samantha was saying about the culture being, I think, like the #1 way to choose whether or not you're interested in a place. I think that's also true of the PhD, right? Like usually when you hear people complaining about their PhD, it's not that the science is going badly, it's usually that they had a bad relationship with their advisor or with their coworkers.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question. What is the worst part of your chosen job?
The timesheets. It really is a pain in the butt, but you know what? I have to laugh about it. That and any classified work, which is just the nature of it, you have to go into this dungeon-esque part of the building where it feels like a casino. There are no windows, no time, no clocks. For some reason, all the clocks are wrong. I don't know if they just do it to like keep you there longer. It works. but I would say those two things. So really, I mean, I am really like disgustingly happy at Rand, and very happy to talk to anybody offline further about it too. So.
Yeah, I generally love my job, pretty much most of it. But of course, there's small routine things. Like, for instance, if you're working on a big text, it's just a nature of human brain to kind of try to not do that. And then you're answering all the emails that could wait 1 or 2 days, right? You're doing all the small stuff, and then you're getting a cup of tea or something like that, right? And it takes really some time to really get into this mood of deep work on the text, because that's sometimes needed, right? And there's so many distractions. And okay, for me, as for a young mother, it's sometimes complicated because I cannot really stay long hours, especially at home. So that's maybe a challenge, right? But I know this about myself, and I just try to work around it. And yeah, sometimes things are too slow because it's a big company, but yeah, this is also, I mean, this is life. You cannot have everything immediately when you want it.
Okay. And Maina, what's about you? So do you have any bad time, like any fighting with Nabiha or?
No, our working relationship with our team is really, really good. I mean, when you're creating the team yourself, like you get to decide who works with you and who stays. So kind of like by default, everyone that you work with is someone that you enjoy working with. The worst thing, it's just really hard. It's just like really freaking hard. When it's a small company, before you have a dedicated finance person, a dedicated HR person, a dedicated salesperson, like the co-founders are doing all of those jobs. So there are a lot of times where I feel like I'm doing 2 or 3 jobs instead of 1.
Okay, so there is another question. What's the favorite part of your job?
I really love my team. I work with the most awesome people ever. And the stuff that the guys are making, engineering wise, really leaves me jaw dropped like every other week. So it's awesome. And people I get to talk to thanks to my job. I mean, thanks to it, I'm here now, right? I mean, it's really great. And I get to make my own magazine. I mean, how many people can tell that?
True. Agree. And Samantha?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to echo the people for sure. Rand has so many people from so many different walks of life, PhDs in literally every subject you could possibly imagine. And it takes maybe 3 minutes of talking to somebody from a completely different field, maybe someone who's been at Rand 20, 30 years, people tend to stay forever. It takes 3 minutes of talking to them about their work to be completely enthralled and feel their passion for the work that they do. So yeah, I would definitely say the people. And I think, like everyone has kind of touched on, I think that that's just such a good thing to look for, whether it is grad school or your job. The culture really does make a big difference and can make it easy for you to stay, especially stay through different chapters of your life. For Anya to be able to take a position as a young mother and like still enjoy her work and still be able to work and have a flexible schedule, like all these things are really important to think about, particularly for women, but I think for men too. Finding a place where you can kind of live out multiple phases of your life is ideal, rather than feeling like, well, eventually I want to have kids, but I know I can't have kids at Rand because the schedule is too demanding. So before I go on to that phase of my life, I need to find a new job or do this or pivot. And so really, I think it's so much of it boils down to that in terms of people's happiness.
I think one should really know oneself, right? Because I know some people, myself, I thrive in a supportive environment. I have worked both in very supportive and very competitive and very borderline toxic environment. I know that I work best when I know my expertise is recognized, respected, I'm supported, people smile at me, nobody's micromanaging, people give me responsibility, and even if I screw something up, it's fine. I can come and talk about this openly, and it's very transparent, and nobody is like doing weird stuff. I have worked in places that were not like that, and some people are fine with that, but I wasn't. So I just I'm happy that I can work in the place where I can bring out my best potential. And I think that's something to optimize for. And that's something important that everybody should decide for themselves, what's important for them.
And Marina.
Yeah, I guess kind of like following up on that, one of the things I love about starting a company is that you can create a company culture that is 100% in line with your values. And so it's really nice having that, the freedom to do that. And the other things I like about it, it's fun, it's challenging, it's super fast paced, things change every day, so you never get bored, which is probably the least, like boredom is probably the biggest thing that negatively impacts my motivation. And that's never a problem with the startup. And I like that there's a lot of room to exercise creativity. So if I'm talking to folks in a specific field and I think that our team has a technology that would benefit them, then I can direct the team towards working on building that product. So that's very cool to be able to do as well.
Yeah, cool. So unfortunately, we have only 5 minutes left. So before I wrap up, I would like to ask all of you a question. What would be your advice for the student, actually, who are the PhD student, who are thinking about different career path after their PhD, from where they should start? And I think there is another question from the audience, a similar kind of question. A guy asked, what would you suggest to a student who does an industrial doctorate and sometimes has difficulties to find a compromise between industry and academy since the supervision is bipolar? Anyway, you can start from the beginning, what would be your general advice, then you can go to the specific question. So, yeah. I think Samantha can start first, then I'll go to Ania, then Marina.
Yeah, so I think my advice is figure out what you like to do and why. Because I think the goal is to find a job that makes you excited to wake up every day and go to work. Even if go to work means like sit at your dining room table. And so I think that's huge. And that's really what keeps me going is I love the work that I do. Yeah, the people are great, all these other things. But when I sit down and do my work every day, I love it. And so finding something where it's not a chore to get out the door and go to your office or go to the lab or wherever it is, I think that's huge. And that can take some time to really sit down and reflect on not what you feel like you should be doing or feel like your advisor wants you to do or any kind of pressure, and just sit down and think about what it is you want. And it doesn't have to be what you've studied. Again, I mean, like I'm doing policy work, which is not, people get PhDs in policy. So like, that's clearly not what I studied. So it's also okay to switch up because that passion and love for what you do is more important than just kind of towing the company line.
I second that. I think it's important to sit down and think what you really like, what really drives you. And you can often find your profession. I mean, we live in the world when you can just invent your own profession, basically, right? And I know people who become science outreach specialists who just have their blogs. I know people who make their living by making science illustrations, etc., etc. I mean, it's virtually endless. And like, if it's really something that you love, or at least think which aspect of your research is that you love the most. Because if you love working in the lab, you'll be miserable writing grant proposals all the time, right? So maybe it makes sense to find a job in whatever company which will give you an opportunity to spend all your time in the lab perfecting or optimizing some processes, whatever, right? So you have to be very clear with yourself on that. That's the most difficult thing, I think, when you're a PhD, because you just sometimes have these ideas that are not necessarily from within you, but from around you. And it's very difficult to distinguish this environment, let's say, influence from what is really you.
Okay, and Marina, we have only 1 minute. Can you please tell very briefly, what would be your suggestion for?
Yeah, I completely agree with what the other two ladies have said. You're working, you know, it's a 40-hour work week, so you're spending at least a third of your waking life working. So you deserve to have it be something you enjoy. And I think you should think about that in terms of like the day-to-day tasks. Do you prefer hands-on work? Do you prefer writing? Do you prefer interacting with people? And then I also think you should think about it from a motivation standpoint, because you want to feel motivated to get work done every day instead of just, you know, always procrastinating and feeling guilty about it. And some people are more motivated by the big picture, like what's the mission of the company that you're working with? And some people are more motivated by the day-to-day tasks. Do they enjoy what they're doing like day in and day out?
Okay, that's really awesome. I think for everyone like me who are in the middle of their PhD and who start thinking about their future job, your suggestion would be really helpful for us. And with that, I'd like to wrap up the session. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks Samantha, thanks Marina, and thanks Tania. I will meet again later, before I wrapping up, I would like to invite everyone to join our next session today and tomorrow. And yeah, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for the invite.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.